Our very special guest for this evening, the director of the Dole Institute, Bill Lacey.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Thanks all of you. That's a little bit hot tonight, Lawrence. Over the last year, while our associate director has been on leave, the Dole Institute's first fellow, Stephen Jakes, who you just met, has stepped in and done an outstanding job organizing our program. Tonight is the last program of the year, and I thought it was a great opportunity to thank Stephen and recognize him for his efforts. Stephen, thank you. Great job. Well, let me also take this opportunity to recognize two individuals whose support helped make this program possible tonight, Brian and Barbara King. Brian and Barbara, you're back there. Raise your hands. I have a lot of things I have to cover here before I get to my introduction, but I also want to take this opportunity to thank a very good friend of the Dole Institute. One of the things that we're very lucky here in doing is we have lots of friends who are always out recruiting speakers for us. And tonight's speaker, we had an individual who comes to a lot of our programs, who's very active here at the Institute, who helped us recruit him, and I want to recognize her as well, Scotty Lengelbach. Scotty? We have General O'Neill and a number of officers from Leavenworth here tonight. We thank you for your attendance. We also want to recognize the wonderful ROTC contingent we have in the back of the room. Guys, it's great to have you here as well. And also, if I can find her, we also have Mrs. Mary Jo Meyers here. And Mrs. Meyers, we're so glad that you could join us. Raise your hand so everybody can say hello. Now, one final thing before introducing our guest. We have 3 student workers here tonight who will be graduating. They had no clue I was going to do this, so hopefully they're all in the room. First of all, Sarah Stacy. Sarah, where are you? Stand up, Sarah. Sarah will be graduating this year. She's been a student worker for this year, and we appreciate your efforts for us. Thank you. And is Michelle out here, or is she still hanging out in the office there? Michelle Tran has worked with us over the last year. She's done an outstanding job, and she is graduating and leaving us to go to the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. Michelle, thanks for your efforts. And last but certainly not least, a young woman who's been part of our team since spring of '05. She's been our student coordinator for the last year. She's really helped us grow the entire student culture that we have here at the Dole Institute of Politics, helped us build our student advisory board, and we're especially sad to see her go, but very happy that she's landed a job with a polling firm in Washington, D.C. through a guest that she met at the Dole Institute, Karen Bentley. Karen, where are you? Karen, stand up back here. Thank you for indulging me on all of those. General Richard B. Meyers retired as the 15th chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff after serving over 40 years in the U.S. Air Force. During his term as chairman, he served as principal military advisor to the President, the Secretary of Defense, and the National Security Council. General Meyers led the U.S. Armed Forces during a time of great threat to our nation's security. He began his term just a few weeks after the September 11th attacks and was instrumental in guiding the U.S. strategy for the war on terror. During his tenure as chairman, the U.S. led international efforts to topple the Taliban and deny al-Qaeda's safe haven in Afghanistan and to defeat the Saddam Hussein regime in Iraq. A native of Kansas City, Kansas, and a 1965 graduate of Kansas State University, and we promise not to hold that against you, General. General Meyers also served as vice chairman and assistant to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He's held command positions at every level. A fighter pilot with over 4,100 hours, General Meyers logged more than 600 combat hours in Vietnam. Currently, he's the Foundation Professor of Military History and Leadership at Kansas State University, holds the Colin Powell Chair of Leadership, Ethics, and Character at the National Defense University, and lives in Washington, D.C. area with his wife, Mary Jo. Now, from an inside source, a few items that are not in the General's formal biography. He rides his Harley, and often. Over Memorial Day weekend, he and Mary Jo will be participating in Rolling Thunder, a bike ride supporting the Country Our veterans and the military in Washington. He also owns 2 sheepdogs and delights in showing off their tricks, although they are not in attendance tonight. The Dole Lecture is one of 3 signature programs of the Dole Institute. It is delivered every year near the anniversary of Senator Bob Dole's wounding in Italy. Previously, the lecture has been delivered by President Bill Clinton, Senator Dole himself, and former Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle. Given that the Dole Lecture is directly related to Senator Dole's service, it is fitting that tonight's Dole Lecture be delivered for the first time by an individual who spent most of his career serving in and leading our armed forces. Please welcome General Richard Meyers.
Thank you all. It is good to be back in Kansas. It's good to be at Kansas University. And I didn't need a permission slip from the other school to come here tonight. I will tell you that all of my family went to KU. My mom, her brother, her sister, my cousins. One cousin was editor of the Jayhawker his senior year here, Phi Beta Kappa. And one other cousin was on a scholarship in electrical engineering. I decided to become a doctor of veterinary medicine, so I went to Kansas State University. And while I never became a doctor of veterinary medicine, I did become a vet. I guess that's what the Lord intended. I didn't know it was going to work out that way, but here we are. So I have a lot of fond memories of Kansas University. I was telling some folks right before dinner. I've run in the K-State or the Kansas relays when I was in high school. I remember following a big guy one time, a guy named Fred Slaughter out of Topeka High School. Fred was about 6'6" and about 220 pounds, went on to play center for UCLA when they had guys named Hazard and Goodrich shooting the ball, and they won several national titles. And he was the tallest guy on the team at 6'6". And I'm lining up next to him over here, probably on the old track. I don't know what's happened to the track. And I thought, nobody that big can ever beat me in a sprint, ever. And I wound up watching his backside for 220 yards and decided right then and there maybe I ought to concentrate on something else in college at some point. The other KU experience that is very vivid, I have lots of them, and part of them is dating my now wife here, because we had a lot of friends here, and we'd come down to Lawrence from time to time. So we have some romantic memories of Kansas University. But the one I remember is as a senior in high school up here for men's glee club state competition in one of the music halls, and it was a beautiful auditorium. I remember that, and I'm standing there next to the glass doors that lead in. We'd finished, and we're out in the sort of the lobby area, and I was backing up, and I fell over the doorstop. And to catch myself, I put my hand against the glass door, which promptly broke. I mean, I guess I put my hand through it, basically, which necessitated going to the infirmary and getting a few stitches and a big bandage. And the reason I remember it is because I went home thinking I've got to run track tonight, but I don't want to run track with this bandage. And the coach saw me and said, "Of course you're going to run track, aren't you?" I said, it was a track meet. I said, "Of course I'm going to run track." So you wind up running with your bandaged, throbbing hand, and I don't remember how I did. I'm sure I was inspired. Before I go any further, we got some. My wife is here. My niece's husband, John Wood, the new U.S. attorney in Kansas City, Missouri, for the Western District of Missouri, is here. John, hold your hand up. Who I've never been able to lecture in front of John and get him to hold still, so now I invited him so I can talk to him. And my sister-in-law, Jan Ballard, and her husband, Bob, and I don't know where the Ballards are there. I guess they're right there. And my wife, Mary Jo, of course, who was there. And the reason I'm here is Scotty Lingelbach, because if people know Scotty, they know that she's like a bulldog on a bone. She never gives up, and when she gets an idea, by golly, it's going to come true before she lets up on it. And she said, you ought to do this sometime. I said, I don't know, Scotty. And so the next thing I know, I'm talking to Bill Lacey. So I do appreciate being here. A couple of stories, and then we'll get into a serious part, and then we'll finish up and get into some questions on anything you think I know anything about, and be happy to talk to you about that. If I were here in uniform, as I've been to this campus before in uniform, there would be probably 6 or 7, 10 people around, the aide, the public affairs person, security detail, all these folks making sure you get around okay and have everything you possibly want. So to say that senior officers are a little bit pampered in that regard, you'd be absolutely right. But there comes a time, and the fact that we found Lawrence on our own tonight, and the Dole Institute, pretty remarkable. My staff would say really remarkable, Meyers. But there comes a time in your career when you know, or in your life when you know that part's over. Being pampered, being a senior officer, being that anybody even cares about you. For Eisenhower, it might have happened when, as the story goes, and the people at the Eisenhower Library don't dispute this, when he was complaining to his assistant after just retiring from the military. He says, listen to this phone, it's making this terrible racket. You've got to go over here and you've got to get this fixed. And his assistant listens to it and says, sir, that's the dial tone. A very good friend of mine, now a very good friend of mine, a fellow that if you're associated with this university, this great university here, probably know John Martin, the artist. How many folks know John, the portrait artist? John is terrific, and when you leave office as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, you're authorized a portrait, and we poured through, proposals from artists, portrait artists from all over the country, and we picked this fellow John Martin because of his portfolio that he turned in. I didn't know that he lived 6 blocks from the high school I went to in Mission, Kansas. I didn't know he was from KU, or maybe that have probably squelched it right there. He is a wonderful artist, and we just had the portrait unveiling not too long ago, and this also brings you down to earth in terms of who you really think you are. And the portrait unveiling was at 9 o'clock in the morning. And so I walk in the Pentagon with my family at 9 o'clock in the morning, and I know that my successor, General Pete Pace, by that time in the morning has had his CIA brief, has met with the Joint Staff, has had his briefing there, has been up talking to the Secretary of Defense, had that morning meeting, and probably come back and done some more paperwork before 9 o'clock coming in to host our ceremony. And I said, well, Pete, the difference between you and me now is I used to do that, but I spent all morning between the time I woke up and getting here following my 2 sheepdogs around picking up poop. And so life has a way of changing just a little bit. That probably is not exactly right. Life's pretty full. I spent 40 years in the military. The plan, and out of ROTC at Kansas State, the plan was never to do that. The plan was 5 years and come back to Kansas City and work for my father. A couple of things about the military that I think, unless you've got somebody that served or you served, you might not understand real well. But the things that kept me in, of course, it was the flying that hooked me. But then it was the culture that you live in. It's the fact that you've got to trust one another. You've got to trust the man on your left, the woman on your right, to get the mission done, and often for your life. And this idea of trust and integrity, and those that have it continue on, those that don't have it you get rid of somehow, was important to me. The idea that it's a meritocracy. Doesn't matter where you went to school, your skin color, your religion, any of your beliefs. If you can produce, then you have a chance of advancing. And that was very appealing. No tolerance for discrimination, also very appealing. And finally, this idea of serving something bigger than yourself. And I don't know why that resonated with me, but it did. And it felt good. Getting up in the middle of the night for some kind of flight briefing at 4 or 5 in the morning to go fly was always okay, because you thought, as you're shaving and putting your clothes on, well, this is about more than just me. It's about our country and what we're supposed to do for our country. So that's why I stayed to 40 years. Nobody at Kansas State, certainly in ROTC, or anybody that knew me very well would ever said, well, we're sure Dick Meyers will be a general and probably the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. That would have never been said. I don't know if you can say it about many people, because so many factors have to come together to ever make that happen. So one thing led to another, and 40 years and 3 months later, I got spit out the other end of the pipeline, never really being my intention. My intention was always to come back to Kansas City, work in business with my brother and that sort of thing. So some things you never know exactly how it's going to work out. I can tell you the 4 years as chairman were the most fulfilling years of my life. People said, did you have fun being chairman? I said, no, those weren't fun years, but they were fulfilling because the challenge was so great. You may remember I was nominated in August to be chairman. 9/11 happened, and I'm in office on 1 October, and 7 days later we're at war in Afghanistan. So things happened. In fact, Mary Jo and I had been walking around Fort Myer after I'd been nominated. I said, I wonder what our challenge will be as chairman. Every chairman has some challenge, some big deal. I wonder what ours will be. And I wish I hadn't asked the question, because just a couple of weeks later we found out what that challenge was going to be. There are some things I've learned in those 4 years, and I'm going to share one of the most serious issues that I'd like to talk to you about at first, and then we'll go on from there. I believe that in a lot of our debate about our national security today, we're debating the wrong thing. We're very much focused on Iraq, which is a very important situation, and I'll talk about that. But the thing I think we should be debating is the threat that we face from violent extremism. It was violent extremism, that was the wake-up call on September 11th. And it was really a hammer blow to the head. But there were plenty of warning signs that go back decades. You don't have to go back very far. Well, 98, when Osama bin Laden declared war on us. And you say, well, it's a small group, and what can they possibly do to us to alter our way of life? And we had the East African bombings, and we had the USS Cole in Aden Harbor in Yemen. And, well, those are State Department workers, and those are Navy folks that are paid to take risk. And I mean, and we did, after the East African bombings, we put 300 plus cruise missiles into Afghanistan, into the training camps of the Al-Qaeda. But they had very little effect, obviously, because it was the wrong munition, and it was always difficult to figure out how to go to a landlocked country and do battle with Al-Qaeda until 9/11, and it then the sense of urgency became a little greater. I have said in uniform, and I've said out of uniform, and oh, by the way, the remarks tonight are my remarks. I'm not running for political office, and I don't work for the government. So maybe it'll help clarify where I'm coming from. And these are my views and my views alone. And by the way, this is a test question. We'll have a civics question here real quickly while we're in transition. How many folks think the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the principal military advisor to the President, and the National Security Council is political, in the sense that the Secretary is political and the President is political? Or are we apolitical? How many think the chairman is political? In other words, if George Bush, there's one hand back there, if President Bush had lost the 2004 election, he'd have picked another chairman. Well, the answer is the chairman is apolitical. And you work very hard to be apolitical, but when you stand next to the President and the next Secretary all the time, people make assumptions, of course. But it's one of the hardest things you do as a professional military man, is to maintain your profession and not be drawn into the politics of it. And that's the way the Constitution reads and the laws of the land, and we ought to be very thankful that's the way it is. There's some countries it's not that way, where the military does get political and eventually sometimes takes over the government from time to time, which is not anything we'd wish on the United States of America. So this threat, in my view, is the most serious threat, the threat from violent extremism, that we face in this country to our way of life since the Civil War. That's my view. I don't get many arguments in academia or anywhere else that might be true. And let me tell you why I think it's true. This is an enemy that's determined. It's an enemy that has a long-range plan. There used to be an Al-Qaeda website that you could go to. I don't know that you can find it. I can't find it anymore. I think it's been long since been down. But their website showed their plan for 100 years. And they colored countries red where they had turned to their form of extreme Islam and had the kind of government that the Al-Qaeda would put in place. And if you go after 100 years, and the North American continent is turned red. Canada, United States, Mexico. I mean, that's their long-range vision. And they're small, but they're undeterred. And if you combine that vision of what they think, their patience and their vision, and you combine it with things like a total ruthlessness and a disregard for human life, and the nexus between that and biological weapons or, God forbid, nuclear weapon or radiological device, this is a very real threat that can have a big impact on us. How do they work? Why are they what's it such a big threat? It's not because they have armies, navies, and air forces, and it's not because they're going to come down Main Street here in Lawrence. That's not going to be it at all. They're going to work on our minds like they work on the minds around the world of folks where they use terror to create fear. In 1941, President Roosevelt talked about 4 freedoms, and one of those freedoms was a freedom from fear, because he understood what fear, how it can grip our minds. If you take yourself back to 9/11 and think about your particular circumstances, I mean, there are businesses now that are just recovering from the effects of 9/11. I know people that still don't fly on airliners because of the fear of being hijacked and run into a building or the ground. I mean, it had a traumatic effect on a lot of our countrymen and people around the world. That's how they want to work. They want to work through fear. We see it in Iraq every day as, you know, they blow up hospitals and schools and these sorts of things. When they went after, you may remember right after Major Combat, when they went after DeMello, the UN chief there in Baghdad. When extremists hurl rockets into Israel indiscriminately, they know they're not going to have a military impact, but what they do know is they're going to create fear. And when we are afraid, then we don't think logically, and we start to make some real mistakes, or we doubt our government, or we do this or that. That's why I think this threat is so dire, and I'll tell you in a minute, I don't think we have the right strategy for the threat, and that it's being lost in the other debates that we're having on important issues, no doubt, but not the central issue that it's eventually going to be, could be the undoing of our way of life. Now, I don't think it's going to be. I think we'll rally, but we're not off to a particularly good start, in my view, in lots of ways. What's our strategy? The strategy after 9/11, and by the way, the day the president came back to Washington after 9/11, you know, in 8 months of working with the commander-in-chief, you got to know him a little bit, and he'd always enter a room sort of bouncy of step, quipping. A typical quip would be, Meyers, Texas played K-State on Saturday. We made a bet. Where's my money? And this would be Monday morning. I'd be sitting there. I might not even notice he's come in the room yet, and he's already, you know. But this time he came in the room, and I've never seen a more somber person. And I think to his core, and this is my belief, he was absolutely shaken by the events of 9/11 and felt that as commander-in-chief and as president of the United States had kind of let the country down, and was determined never to let that happen again. And he said something at the end of this session. We had the National Security Council convene. We were actually in the east wing of the White House, way down deep, sort of the Cold War bunker part of the White House that some of these men here in the Dole Institute probably are very familiar with, that we very seldom had meetings in. And at the end of the meeting, he said something that was gratifying to a lot of us. It astounded, and I think probably caused fear in his political handlers, but it was, okay, well, by then we knew it was Al-Qaeda. We didn't have any real plans for the next move. We were just talking about, in general, what are we going to have to do. And the president said, well, he said, folks, I think probably in the next couple of years we're going to have to do some things that are going to be very, very unpopular to secure our country. And if that means this is a 4-year presidency, then so be it. And most of us thought that's good commitment, Mr. President. Of course, his political handlers, there was this 32-molar suck going on in the back going, sure you want to say that? But so whether you think the president is right or whether you think he's wrong, I think that's what motivated him early on into what he wanted to do. He was very determined not to let this happen again on our soil. And thank goodness it hasn't. I think the probability of more terrorist attacks on our land is probably, I think you'd be foolish to think it's not high. There have been 30 major terrorist attacks since 9/11 in the rest of the world. 30. It's a goodly number. And if you think about it, you can probably think of 4 or 5 on your own. The strategy initially was offense, defense, and then some sort of long-term strategy. The defense, you remember we started the Department of Homeland Security trying to to figure a way to better secure our country through the departments and agencies of government that could do that. There's a reformed intelligence community that was led by the White House and Congress. We established the Director of National Intelligence so we wouldn't, again, have this inability of our civilian law enforcement agencies and our national intelligence agencies, their inability to communicate and talk. So we fixed some of those problems. We stood up a new military command called Northern Command out in Colorado Springs. Now it's, NORAD was always there. NORAD was the Air and Missile Defense Command with our Canadian brethren. This is one that's focused on the security of we've never had one before because I don't think we ever felt the real need to have a command focused on our security. It was just improbable, other than defense of air and missiles, that somehow we'd come under attack. But this is a new age. It's a new century. And so that was stood up. But the realization was that no matter how much barbed wire you put around something or how many walls you build, somebody dedicated to a mission and willing to die in the cause, you really can't protect yourself adequately. So there had to be an offensive component. The first part you saw in Afghanistan. And just a little anecdote there, just for the techies in the audience. You've seen a lot of the movies where usually it's about the CIA and they have these cameras and they're seeing people running from Washington, D.C. Well, early on in the campaign in Afghanistan, we wanted to make sure that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda knew this is a different commitment of the United States Armed Forces than the 300 cruise missiles that came in there last time. We're going to put Americans on the ground. And we weren't on the ground. We weren't on the ground in Afghanistan yet. We were still trying to get our special forces in with the Northern Alliance up north. And we took down the leader of the Taliban, Mullah Omar's compound. It looked like it looked like Leavenworth, the prison, the federal prison, but just in kind of miniature. And the fascinating thing was, through infrared technology, you could watch all this happen in Washington, D.C. in real time. You could see the helicopters land. It's nighttime. See the dust swirl up. You could see the troops get out of the back, put breaching charges on the doors, rush in there. And we knew it would probably be a fallow attempt in terms of any intelligence gain. Certainly the people you'd want would be gone. But we did it just to say, this is going to be a different effort, and for the psychological impact. And you could watch that from Washington. Some people like that. Some people that like to control things like to be able to watch things from Washington, thinking if I just had a 7,500-mile screwdriver, I could dial this thing in pretty well. They offered that to Secretary Rumsfeld. Well, you need this capability right here in your office. He said, not on your life. And I had to talk to the Air Force, who had some of these assets that were taking some of these pictures, this streaming video, and say, you can do a post-mortem on what could have gone better, but while the effort's going on, it's the commanders in the field that can talk, and we can observe. And I don't remember ever observing another activity like that, but that one we did. And it was just, for the techies in the audience, it was quite amazing that half a world away you're watching your troops execute a mission in the middle of the night in a landlocked country. So we've had the defense and the offense. The part I'd like to spend just a minute of time on is the long-term strategy. And I'll make this real easy. I'm from Kansas, so I like real simple analogies. How many have been to Chuck E. Cheese? I've got some folks who've been to admit it. I know you don't. You have you never go there to dine, but you take your kids there so they can play the games. And I don't know what they call the game today because I haven't been back for a long time. But you know the whack-a-mole machine where the things pop up. I would say this is a very crude analogy, but our strategy is more like the whack-a-mole machine today, where the terrorist pops up and we whack them. Okay, and that's been somewhat effective. But in the end, if you want a safer land for our children and our grandchildren, where they can travel the world and experience other cultures and architecture and the arts, we need a safer place. And you got to get to the point where men and women don't want to join jihad. And the way you do that is not keep playing the game up here. You got to take the back of that machine off and change the algorithms that control who wants to pop their head up. That is, people will say, well, we could never get to that strategy. Well, they said the same thing about the Cold War. Right after World War II, the world was looking pretty bleak. I mean, France was going communist. Italy, China declared it was going communist. The wall went up. All these things that that made things look pretty bleak, but then we came up with a strategy, and in the end, we're successful, and we have a free Eastern Europe. It took decades. My guess is any kind of strategy along this line to get to the point where the moderates of the world, the tolerant people of the world, predominate, those that have respect for others, will take decades. But we're not going to get there if we don't start the strategy. And the strategy will be a lot more other instruments of national power than the U.S. military. The military will play a role. There's always things that the military is going to have to do, and especially in helping other countries develop their own security apparatus, be it armies or police or whatever it is. And as you know, the State Department is big into police training primarily. Other instruments of national power, like diplomacy, like education, like economics, like information. And these are all areas that need to be blended together in a strategy, not just a U.S. strategy, but a strategy with our friends and allies, as much of the international community that wants to be part of it, to start working on this problem. So come this Friday, as your strategy starts to work, there'll be one or two less mosques in the world that preach hatred towards the West. Or there'll be some madrasa that will decide that it needs to teach other things other than the Quran in terms of preparing young men and women for life in the 21st century. I don't know if it's possible, but I know if we do nothing, that this problem is never going to get any better. And there are people out there, my friends around the world, that of all different religions and persuasions, that all want the same thing when you sit down and talk about it. We want a secure and safe environment for our children and our grandchildren to grow up in. That's what we want. And there are a lot of people like that don't want to follow some extreme view. And I think this part of the strategy, you can go on there's a White House website where you can go on and look at our strategy to this point. I think one of the things you'll find missing in that strategy is that it's way too U.S. centric, and this has to be an international effort. And I think the United States has to be the engine to help this along, but it's going to take a lot of help. Perfect work for the UN if they could muster the talent to do this. But that's what's lacking in the strategy. Real quickly on how we're doing that, I'm going to get a couple stories and then we'll go to Q&A. I think against the Al-Qaeda, I would put it this way. If Osama bin Laden on 9/11 had a board of directors, and he did, he had about 7 people that he counted on, he'd be on about his third set of board of directors by now. They've been killed or captured. That's the good news. And their ability to operate in the world has been severely curtailed by all the efforts that have been taken by the military and the law enforcement internationally, domestically. There has been some good effect on curtailing their ability to roam their allotted territory. But they aren't deterred, and it doesn't take very many at any one time, as we saw on September 11th, to cause real havoc. I don't know how many were involved in the Heathrow plot, but just imagine if that many airliners had blown up over the North Atlantic. That would have been many thousands, probably dead. So, this is a real threat, and it needs to be dealt with, I think, in a very serious way. So against the Al-Qaeda, they're down but not deterred. And somebody can ask questions if you think we're devoting enough resources and all that. That's a good question for the Q&A period. On Afghanistan, you know now that NATO is in charge of the security and stability and the reconstruction from that standpoint in the country. And they've been inching towards that, but now they have the entire country is their responsibility. There happens to be an American in charge of the NATO forces now, but that'll give way probably to somebody from Great Britain later on. This is a big deal when an organization in Brussels that's been so Eurocentric, so focused on the Soviet Union in the past, has now got its flag in Kabul and is worried about that country. I think the fact they have a constitution, elected government, they're working their issues. The biggest issue in Afghanistan from my standpoint is the fact that through decades of war, that their infrastructure, as poor as it was, is almost non-existent. So what they need in that country is a rural development program, the power, the transportation, the water, so they can have alternatives to growing poppies, which is relatively easy to do, and, oh, by the way, very profitable. So so if we think that problem's going to go away anytime soon, it's not. The good news is I think the international community is very much focused there. And so I feel pretty good about Afghanistan. And by the way, it's also going to take good cooperation from their neighbor Pakistan. They've got to do a little better job of trying to control that border where the tribal groups, particularly those that are friendly to the Taliban or are the Taliban, to control their movement so they don't have safe haven places they can go for medical treatment and so forth. All this takes time, and none of it is easy as it is to stand up here and say that's what it has to happen. And I'm sure there are probably more questions on that. On Iraq, when I left office, I was pretty optimistic about Iraq because what had happened is we'd had a vote. They had a constitution that most people thought was pretty liberal. By the way, President Bush made a big point, and this was a decision point. I have not seen anybody write on it yet, but how many political science folks do we have in the audience? Does anybody study political science? Well, as you may know, the United States is not opposed to getting involved in other governments' work from time to time. I remember my first run on it. But there was as elections were looming in Iraq, the question was, well, how much involvement will the United States have? And the president said, 0. This will be their democracy, whatever it is, and we may have people that we think would be better in that government than others, but in the end, they're going to have to. Oh, but sir, Iran's going to be funding some of these folks that we can't stand. That may be, and the Iraqis are going to have to figure it out. Which I thought, by the way, was the right stand. But we had a constitution, fairly liberal constitution for that part of the world, liberal in the sense that can't define in the time we have to talk, but a pretty good constitution, most people thought. A parliament that was elected and a government that was elected. The government wasn't elected when I left office. And violence that had stayed about the same level for a couple of years, which was not good. But Iraqi forces were still being built. We were in about the first year of building up Iraqi forces and the police force, so more to come there. A lot of that turned in February 2006 with the bombing of the mosque in Samarra, and we all know the rest of the story. We can talk about that. I think the key is, and I think some of the debate you see in Washington now, the key is how well the Iraqi government performs. And I think there's a big question mark there. They've done some things well. Other things, they don't appear to be willing to take the action they need to quell the violence in the way that should be done. So, but in the president's speech when he talked about the surge, I was gratified to see he didn't talk just about troop buildup. He talked about what politically had to be done and economically what had to be done. And it's important in insurgencies, if you do the research in insurgencies, you find out, for the most part, that it's not just a security issue and it's not just a political issue or an economic issue. It's all three of those have to sort of progress basically simultaneously. And we had lots of debates in the White House. Well, if we were just more secure, we could have better political progress. Well, we're not going to be able to secure this big country unless we start working the de-Baathification issue in reverse and reconciliation and all those other issues. I mean, and that's what has to happen. And so I think that's what a lot of the debate is in Washington, people trying to put the pressure on the Iraqi government to perform. I wish I could this would be way out of place for me to do it, but somebody make me the Secretary of Defense tomorrow. I think every night before I went home, I'd say, I haven't called the Prime Minister yet, and called Prime Minister Maliki, say, what have you done lately? Being a little facetious, but I mean, you need constant pressure, and they have a lot of pressure on them, but to know that as long as we're spending our blood and treasure, they need to be doing their part. What's it take to win? It takes all elements of national power to win in Iraq, Afghanistan, the larger issue. It takes patience, which we do not have very much of in this country, I've learned. Will and resolve, which we have a lot of if we're properly informed, which leads me to a comment on what it takes to win. I think our debate today is so fractious, so vitriolic, so political in nature, it's hard to stay informed by listening to your normal media methods. And you better have sources you think do a pretty good job of providing the perspective you need so you can be informed. The democracy only works when we're well informed. It does not work well and will endanger ourselves if we make our decisions on an uninformed basis. And I think today that we're being denied good information for them. I remember leaving my nice quarters on Fort Myer and going to my little townhouse and painting this sucker. And painting to me is fun but boring, so you turn the news on, and I'm watching cable news. And here's a guy, I've been working with the media a lot, and I said, oh my goodness, is this how Americans are getting their news from some of this stuff? They'd go from the bus fire somewhere to some important national security issue, and they'd give it about 2 seconds, and then we'd be back to the bus fire. And the debate is so charged politically. Brian Jenkins wrote a book about 8 months ago, on terrorism. He's a fellow at the Rand Corporation who studied terrorism for about 30 years. Brian made this comment. He said, our debate now is so fractious. Said it reminds him of the Crips and the Bloods. We have these two camps, like these gangs, the Crips and the Bloods, except they have better tailors. I think there's some truth to that. I'm going to switch gears a little bit to troop morale. One of the things I did right before I left office in August of 2005, in May actually, I decided what I'd like to do is, we've been working folks now for almost 4 years, working them really, really hard. Lots of folks have been in combat. Families have been worrying back home. What is the troop morale? And I said to my public affairs guy and to my executive officer, I said, I'd like to take a trip around the world and see the troops. And it wasn't a farewell trip. It had no tinge of that. It was just to go see the troops. And it turns out when the chairman wants to go around the world, they show up with lots of airplanes. It's real easy. And I called my friends at the USO and I said, they don't want to see the general very long, but if I could bring some entertainment along. So we brought a couple of comedians that were pretty funny guys. And then we looked for a sports figure. And we tried to find an active sports figure, somebody still active in sports. And you think about August. Who can you find in August that's not engaged in either working up in a sport or just spooling down in the sport? And you really can't find anybody. So we went to the NFL, which has been a great supporter of the military, as you know from some of their ads and other things they do at the Super Bowl and other football games. And they came. They said, we'll give you an NFL Hall of Famer. And they picked a guy that maybe you know the name, Gale Sayers. I'm going to tell a story on Gale, so next time he's on campus, you can ask him if this is true or his version. And by the way, we went around the world 10 days, 25,000 miles, 15,000 troops, 18 different kind of shows. And a show would be, I'd start off talking a little bit, thanking them for their service and that sort of thing. The comedians would come on. Gale would end the little show, and then we'd go out and mingle and take pictures and shake hands until it was time to go to the next location. They respected me. They were respectful, as you would expect. They laughed at the comedians, but they got tears in their eyes and always applauded Gale. And he wasn't sure what he was going to say when we started out. In fact, he wasn't sure that he ought to even go on this trip. He said, is this going to be safe? And my comment, it's going to be as safe as, well, it's going to be pretty safe, Gale. They're going to take pretty good care of me, and because you're in close proximity, we're going to be fine. But he had a very uplifting message. He must still have a pretty good attachment here at Kansas University, my guess is, because he's so involved in things around the country and the world. I'm going to tell this one story on him. We go to a ship in the Persian Gulf, and it's August in the Persian Gulf, and we're on the hangar deck. It's just hotter than blazes. Every other time I'd been to a ship in the Persian Gulf, it was in December. It was tolerable. August, and they were trying to get air coming through the hangar deck. They couldn't do it. And we had all the sailors and the few Marines that are on, and from the rest of the battle group, and flight ops were underway. We were part of a regular deal. And we land on the deck on the helicopter, no, the COD. The COD. How many have landed on a helicopter? How many naval aviators do we have? Keep me straight here on terms of, but the COD is a turboprop airplane that has a fuselage that you sit backwards in this thing, and it has no windows. It has a couple little windows, but they're not where anybody can see out of. And they tell you to strap in real tight, and you have a 5-point harness, and you strap in. You have earmuffs for the noise. It's it's such a basic airplane that you feel like just being a passenger, you're part of the structure because it all comes around you, and it's the pipes and the dripping hydraulic fluid and the vapor from the air conditioning. We go out and land on the carrier, and the tail hook grabs, and it's a no-brainer because you're facing backwards, so all the pressure is where? It's on your back. Oh, that was pretty easy. We go down and we do our show. The only thing notable about the show is one of the comedians decided he was too hot and he took his pants off. And the only reason I knew that is my public affairs officer, a Navy captain, goes running across in front of me. We're out now shaking hands with people. And I heard a lot of commotion, saw him running, and later asked him what happened. He says, well, are you okay? Well, no, they're going to forget about you in about 2 seconds here. And reminded this comedian that this is not appropriate behavior. Please put your pants back on. When it got time to go, you get back on the cod. Now, this time, of course, they're going to shoot you off the catapult, where you go from 0 to 140 miles an hour basically in about 2 seconds. And all the force is going to be against the straps. So you're sitting backwards, front of the airplane's that way, so you're going to be forced this way. And there's a seat back in front of you. And if you not fasten in, you're going to rearrange your nose and other things. It's going to be pretty unpleasant. And it's real noisy. It's hot. It's noisy. They have a little ramp on the back. It's down. You hear all this noise. You smell all the jet stuff. And then they button it up, and then you hear the shoe hit or the click on the nose gear, and you know it's about time. You hear the engines run up, and it's vibrating. It's sitting there, and it's noisy, and it's vibrating, and it's hot. And then in 2 seconds, you're airborne, and it gets just, in a relative sense, deadly quiet. And that's when I'm sitting here, and that's when Gale Sayers was sitting here, and he turns around, and he looks at me, and with this, like, are we going to live? Is that it? Are we dead? And I gave him a thumbs up. Of course, I didn't know whether they're going to live or die, but I didn't want him to die all tensed up on this trip. That's my Gale Sayers story. I can still see him turn around saying, why is it so quiet? But you couldn't talk, of course. And, one more little anecdote about morale. And I think if you ask anybody today in the service, morale actually, and I still try to take the pulse, whether it's with folks at Fort Riley. I've had a tour of Fort Riley not too long ago. Yes, armed forces are being worked very hard, but recruiting, retention, generally the statistics are all good. National Guard doing great. I met a Kansas National Guard major going back to Iraq for the second time in Atlanta Airport not too long ago down at the USO there. And I said, why are you going back a second time? Because the Guard hasn't been required to go back twice unless they volunteer. I said, you're a volunteer? He says, yes, that makes my employer very unhappy, but I am. He said, it's because my unit, I went the first time the unit went. Now the rest of the unit is going. And I know the place, and I know the hazards and how to get along. And I felt I better go back and help them a second time through. I mean, that's the kind of people we have serving. This is a good Kansas guy, a major in the Kansas National Guard. One story about a mom I met at Walter Reed. I was one of the things you can do in Washington, of course, is visit with those that have been wounded. And of course, you know the wounds today are terrible because we save them with the body armor, and if it's a blast, then what gets hurt is their extremities, to include the head in some cases. This one young man had lost a leg below the knee, and I'm sitting there talking to him, and his mom's in the room, and she didn't say anything. She just stood there, and she was a very gentle-looking lady. I'm not doing a very good job of describing her, but she was just the gentlest looking lady you've ever seen, just a typical all-American mom. And when I finished talking to the soldier, on the way out she tugs me on the sleeve and said, can I talk to you in the hall? I said, of course. And we go out in the hall, and here you have a chance to talk to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Son's just lost a leg in combat. I was prepared for, why are you such an idiot, to whatever that was going to come up. And I was floored by her, what she asked me. And I'm telling you this because this is not outside 2 standard deviations of the kind of comments that I would usually get. But hers tops it all. It may be pretty close to one side. She said, well, my son in there has always wanted to be an Army Ranger. Do you think that injury is going to keep him from fulfilling his dream? I said, holy mackerel, Mom. If that were my son or daughter in there, I would have 1,000 questions for the chairman. That would not be the first one. But that's what she was thinking of, and thank God for her, and thank God for her family, and thank God for her son. My guess is that if he wanted to, he could be an Army Ranger, because the Army's working really hard with the folks that can still serve, and they'll find a way. And Ranger training is really tough, and I know we have some folks who have been through Ranger training, but he wouldn't be the first one-legged soldier to go through Ranger training, if I'm not mistaken. So he could do it if he wanted to. How many have read the book 1776? We had David McCullough. I think it's a terrific book because it tells you. I've talked about this threat that is not going to be an easy threat to deal with. We've talked a lot about, some bad things that can happen. We haven't talked at all because we don't have the time, except for this little bit, to talk about the American spirit, the American character. And I think you learn a lot about that in 1776. Yes, we were young, but we showed a lot of things in 1776. We showed courage and perseverance. I think we showed a little bit of a sense of humor when our general, Washington, was kicked out of Boston and New York and was down in New Jersey in the winter of 76, and his army went from tens of thousands to, less than a couple thousand or a couple of thousand. And yes, we had a victory then at the end of the year. But in the middle of that year, as our army's getting kicked out of all these major cities by the British, what do? We signed the Declaration of Independence. That's got to show some optimism and a little bit of humor in there too, Take this, guys. We'll be back. And we were, eventually. And it teaches you something else. We had David McCullough to a joint staff offsite, and he and his wife Rose came out. And if you haven't met them, they're wonderful people. And we talked about 1776 and the larger meanings. And we all concluded that the Declaration of Independence, our Constitution, the Bill of Rights are wonderful documents, great prose, look very good on parchment, read well. But they really don't mean a thing unless your average citizen is willing to sacrifice to bring them to life. And I'm not talking about the military here. I'm talking about all of us. If 9/11 taught us anything, it taught us that we're all in this together. And whether you're in education or in religion or in music or in the military or in business, whatever it is you do, we all have to pull together if we're going to be successful in the threat that I talked about or in thwarting dealing with any of these issues that this country faces. And I think that's what I learned out of the book 1776, especially after talking to David McCullough about it. It was a wonderful, wonderful experience. Let me leave you with a quote before we go to Q&A. If there are any historians in the audience, I've got my standing $10 bet. Be careful for the military guys. I'll keep a $10 bet for anybody that can come up with the author of this quote. But one of the things you get to do when you retire is kind of do your own reading. When I was in uniform, you're forced to read whatever comes across your desk. As you now know, some of that was nonfiction and some of it was fiction. But you got to read it anyway. Delay that remark. Disregard. So here's the quote. So I got to do some of my own reading. I picked up a quote, and it's, as far as I'm concerned, it sums up what I think we need to be thinking about on a day-to-day basis. And it's from a former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which is one of the reasons I like it. And it's a quote on freedom, and this is how it goes. Freedom. No word has ever been uttered that has held out greater sacrifice. Needed more to be nurtured. Blessed more the giver. Damned more its destroyer, or come closer to being God's will on earth. May America ever be its protector. Any guesses? Oh, come on, Scotty. Okay, Scotty? Okay. Well, he could answer it. Let me just give you the answer. It's Omar Bradley, our first chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he said that in 1947 after the World War II experience. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, I was in Hawaii when you were there, and we celebrated the 60th anniversary of Pearl Harbor. And I want to ask you, were you ever personally, during your military career, stationed at Hickam Field? And if so, during your career, did you ever go down to the Solomon Islands and especially Guadalcanal?
The answer to the first part. The answer to the first part is yes. I was stationed at Hickam Air Force Base for a year. I was lucky enough to be the commander of Pacific Air Forces, which was terrific assignment, and no, I never made it, other than flying over the Solomon Islands, never was able to visit them. At the 50th anniversary of the, I think we call it the end of the war in the Pacific, in deference to our Japanese allies. Now, we did go to Iwo Jima, my wife and I did, and they brought several plane loads of Marines in to Iwo Jima, probably for the second time in their life. And we got to land on those black sands of Iwo Jima. That's what I remember, this black sand. I still have a vial of it at home. You got to walk around the island, and they have this sulfur smell. You think it's your person walking next to you, and it's this sulfur bubbles out of this vapor comes out of the ground, giving this kind of this strange sulfur smell, and all the little dugout installations that the Japanese had there. But no, I've not done that. Thank you for your service. Appreciate it. Thank you. Have to wait your turn, Scotty. In the back.
Yes, General Meyers. This is going to relate to the comments you've made about respect for the U.S. military, comments on freedom, the American spirit, and character, and serving something better, and trust and integrity. First two caveats. One, war is hell. The second, if I would have been drafted, if Vietnam had lasted long enough for me to be drafted, I'm sure I would not be here today. World War II saw the establishment of comfort stations in Japan. Korea saw the no-gun incident, which we found out 2 weeks ago. The U.S. military did have a policy of shooting refugees. Vietnam, we had the My Lai massacre, and a personal comment that I was told about 20 years ago, and women, please shut your ears. I don't believe that soldiers should be pretended that they speak not like soldiers. This is a story I was told from a Marine.
Excuse me, sir. Excuse me, sir. Please ask your question.
Okay.
We please ask out of respect for everyone else here that you ask a specific question.
We have 50 years of incidents. What I would like to know is, George Tenet today said something about living in a moral continuum. What is the military's moral continuum, and what should I, as an American citizen, expect it to be?
Well, that's a good question, and I knew where you were going when you stood up. So we could have made the question a little bit shorter. And it's a good question, by the way, because you could have mentioned other things that I think are just as appropriate. You could talk about Abu Ghraib. You could talk about the Pat Tillman incident as other examples of where your military has not been perfect. And I think the way I would answer that is that there is an organization that I know of that has higher standards in any category of the United States military, or tries to live up to them any harder. It turns out, though, that the military is like the rest of humanity, and we're all imperfect, and we all make mistakes. And there are always going to be mistakes. And I'm not even going to use the war is hell, because it's worse than that. It's unimaginable. That does not mean that you become the lowest common denominator when you're afflicted by conflict. You still have to do what you think is morally right and best. And as much as you don't want friendly fire incidents, as much as you don't want the Pat Tillman incident, as much as you don't want the Abu Ghraib incident, we are imperfect. And that doesn't mean we don't strive, though, to be a very moral and upstanding organization. And in my 40 years, and in working with the troops, and I've visited thousands of troops, this is the human condition. It probably occurs less in the United States military given the stresses than in the rest of society. And I'm very proud to have worn the uniform, and I think the people that are wearing it are very proud. And let me give you a personal case. Let me give you a personal case. The personal case would be Japan. The year would be 1995. And you may not remember because you probably weren't, I mean, you're probably too young to be reading maybe you're reading the paper center. I couldn't see how old you were, so I can't tell. But you may remember the rape of the 12-year-old Japanese schoolgirl. Now, a 12-year-old Japanese schoolgirl probably looks like she's about 9 or 10 or 8 or something. They look particularly young. I think it was 2 sailors drank some alcohol and raped this young lady. I was Commander U.S. Forces Japan, and it was one of the lowest days of my life in Japan because I had so many Japanese friends and so forth. Did that mean every American serviceman serving in Japan was a rapist? Obviously not. And when you did the calculation of the number of folks that were incarcerated in Japan, U.S. servicemen incarcerated in Japanese jails for serious crimes like this, the percentage, I mean, you had to run the percentage out of those that behaved were 99.99999 and just kept going because we had about 25 in jail out of the 43,000 that served in Japan. The Japanese understood that too. Do we want that to happen? No. Do we think we're perfect? No. Do we have to have policies and training and education in place to make sure those things don't happen and all the incidents you mentioned and others? Yes. Are they acceptable? Absolutely not. And that was the argument when it came to the Geneva Convention and torture and other issues that I personally got involved in. And I still hear it today. Some people will say, well, why don't we just go kill them all? Well, if you want to be a terrorist, good attitude. If you want to be an American, we're not going to do that. And it's not like fighting with one arm behind our back. It's what we stand for. And it's important. And we're not going to be perfect, but we'll press on. Next question. Scotty, we're working our way back up here.
It's been said that if treason prospers, none dare call it treason. And I'm just curious as to your thoughts on the consideration that Democrat Senator Harry Reid's declaration of our loss in Iraq and his pushing of laws to force us out of Iraq before the job is done, how that may not be considered treason.
That is a very interesting question. I've worked very hard to stay apolitical. I think if I touch that in any way, shape, or form, let me just say this. Given the seriousness of the challenges that I think we face, not the least of which is one in Iraq, but I think that's, as I told you tonight, I think there are other issues we ought to be focused on as well. I really felt since the last presidential election that the tone in Congress went from bipartisan. The question you would hear very often in testimony in front of Congress before the last presidential election was, well, General Meyers, I didn't vote to go into Iraq, but now that we're there, we've got to be successful. So let me ask you this question. And that gave way then through the presidential election, which you would figure would become more partisan, the questioning. And I thought maybe after the last presidential election it would go back to a more bipartisan sort of effort. And obviously it hasn't. It gets exacerbated by both sides. By both sides, I think, or could do something to help this. And I think when we're talking about national security, all I would say is I'd like to see a lot more bipartisan effort on this, whatever it is, and really serious dialogue on the very serious questions that we have before us when our troops are away from their families and taking great risk to be away and dying. I'm not going to address specific comments, but I I would like to see some strategic leadership out of all branches of government. Scotty, we're coming to you because they may turn the mic off before I get to you.
Here you are, ma'am.
I am Scotty Linkelbach. I wondered if you'd had a chance to read the Tennant book, and if so, what some of your thoughts might be.
I haven't had a chance to read it. I was on the road when it came out, and I didn't hear the 60 Minutes interview, although Mary Jo told me some of that, and my son-in-law told me some of that. So I probably don't have any. I don't think I could comment. I better read the book before I comment. I know George Tenet pretty well. We work very closely together. It's pretty clear he feels wronged, and I'd like to read the book and get the gist of what he's thinking about. But some of what I've heard is pretty accurate. I mean, what I've just heard in terms of this and that, and I'm sure he'll tell it to the best of his ability. It's not an easy thing to do, but I don't have. I better read the book before I. I'm sorry. Oh, we all saw the same intelligence. He would have known, presumably, he would have had access to some of the sources that we didn't have access to, which might have given some question, but maybe Secretary Powell did as well before he went to the UN because he spent a lot of time on that. So, yeah. So, and we were together in lots of interesting circumstances. One of the most interesting was March 19th, right before major combat in Iraq, when we had a chance to. The intelligence came in that we had a chance to go after Saddam Hussein, who was going to be in a specific location in just south of the city of Baghdad. And the National Security Council basically asked to come to the Oval Office, and it was March, and it was about 5:30 at night, so it's already dark out. You know, I can remember looking out of the windows to the lawn of the White House and how dark it was, and trying to make the decision: do you go after Saddam Hussein? How good is the intelligence? How good does it have to be before you launch a strike? Because major combat was going to start the next day, and we all knew that. We all knew the timing and everything. And do you do it and kill Saddam Hussein and negate the need for war, potentially? Or do you do it and you make a mess of it, and there's so many civilian casualties that you get the international community to condemn the action and you can't go to war? And there's some other combinations and permutations that you think about. And George was a big player there because it's his intelligence that was helping us make that decision. And as you may know the story, we decided to do it. And we got all kinds of reports. The first report is, we've seen Saddam on a stretcher. He's mostly dead. Kind of like the Princess Bride movie, you know, he's mostly dead. What does that mean, mostly dead? Well, he's got an oxygen mask. He's not moving, and, you know, they're not paying much attention to him, so he's probably dead. Well, of course, as we found out later, he probably was never there. Thank goodness we didn't hurt anybody else. But, so I have to read the book to be a fair critic, and I know he's passionate. I've heard that part, but he's of Greek origin, and he tends to be passionate from time to time. Never seen him dance, but I assume he does.
We have time for two more questions, one at the back of the room and then one that you can select up here in the front.
I want this political science student who's been keeping an eye on me the whole time to ask the last one. So, the back of the room. I'm sorry I can't see that far back.
All right. Hello, here I am.
Fine.
All right. My question is, to what extent do you feel that the Israel, like in particular Ariel Sharon or the Israel lobby, affected or possibly influenced the turn in attention from Afghanistan post 9/11 to Iraq?
My personal opinion, I think zero. Absolutely zero. I was never aware of any of that. So if it occurred, it wasn't in any of the meetings, and I was in lots of them, or that might have been mentioned, but that was never an issue. There's a whole other issue about the Middle East peace process, but that's not the question you asked. So I'll stick to zero. Okay, political science student, graduating this year, senior,
I'm graduating next year, General.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
Okay.
It's quite all right.
Future governor of Kansas here. He's a.
No, I got my picture taken with you earlier. You better be careful. I might be asking, if that can go out on a mailer in a few years now.
I don't have that power. I don't have any power. I pick up.
I was intrigued. I ran across some polling samples the other day, and I found that in recent polling, there's one demographic of Americans who feel more at threat and are worried about threats more than anybody else. And that demographic is Democrats. So as a Democrat, I'm wondering, am I tilting at windmills, or do I have some legitimate concerns? Before September 11th, this country was concerned about, fundamentals. We were concerned about domestic and foreign terrorism, but we were also concerned about other things, like nuclear weapon proliferation. We were concerned about the ratification of nuclear weapon-free zone treaties. We were concerned about the deterioration of Russian nuclear weapon launch sites. So the question I have for you is whether those concerns are still legitimate and whether the war on terrorism has neglected our attention on such issues.
That's a great question. There are a lot of concerns in the world, and I don't think it has. Let me give you a couple examples. We don't talk about this much anymore, but we were really at one time worried about Libya. Why? Because we knew they were building a cascade to do uranium enrichment. They were getting missile technology from North Korea, and they had this uranium enrichment with this fellow from Pakistan, A.Q. Khan, you may remember. It's all gone away because that issue's gone away. The proliferation issue is a huge issue, but I think if you look at the record really carefully, and this is not a plug for the Bush administration, but they have addressed that in a fairly serious way, and hopefully, I don't know if it'll ever be an adequate way, but in a fairly serious way, as one example. So, on the other hand, I think when you have situations, particularly like Iraq, which take a lot of time of senior leaders in Washington, that you don't spend as much time on other issues. But you try. You try very, very hard. But it's always a balance. I don't know that it's had a big detraction on the overall war on terrorism. Nobody's asked that question, but I don't think we've lost anything vis-a-vis Al-Qaeda by our actions in Iraq, necessarily. In fact, necessarily. No, I think on the serious issues, the serious security issues, that they've been addressed in a pretty robust way. And let me give you another couple examples. In my military career, we never had a relationship with the Indian military, ever, until the last couple of years. That's been a huge thing for this country and for India to forge the relationship that we forged here, I'd say, in the last 4 or 5 years. It's just been absolutely phenomenal. And now all our military services have a relationship with all the Indian military services. That's important, that the world's largest democracy and the world's best democracy have this relationship. And it's and one of trust and transparency, and it's building because they have nuclear weapons, and they sometimes get very excited about their neighbor who also has nuclear weapons, and you want to have the ability to have dialogue. And I'll tell you a little story. What was it? Was it 3 or 4 years ago when Pakistan and India went to battle stations? I can't remember. It was 2003? Huh? 4? When they went to battle stations, thank you. And they both started spending enormous amounts of their own gross domestic product on mobilizing their forces, putting them on the borders. And I happened to be traveling in the region, and I remember, you can have wonderful conversations with your Pakistani counterpart and your Indian counterpart until somebody brings up Pakistan, and then both of them, screw themselves in the ceiling with these very serious arguments about this and that. When we were talking about the potential for conflict, I got the feeling that both countries thought of nuclear weapons as just bigger bombs. Well, it's just a bigger bomb. Well, it's not. It has a whole different impact. And I came back and talked to Secretary Rumsfeld. I said, what we need to do is we need to get somebody over there who understands weapons effects, and we do that because we used to test and all that. We know weapons effects. Let's go over and tell them what we can tell them about the effect this would have on their countries and the region if they ever decided to do that. They need to know, because I don't get the feeling they have a full understanding of this. So that's one issue. China. China is more open and transparent every day. And that's an important thing, I think, for security, because if nothing else, China, Taiwan, and the likelihood they would ever go to conflict, and if they did, we'd be in it. That's pretty much what the law says, basically. But that's what the president said, I think, as well. And so we don't want to be drug into that fight. It's not good for the region, the world, our economies, their economies. And so as long as China continues to be open and transparent and our relationship continues to blossom, I think that's what it's all about. So those are some examples, I think, where things are. We have a relationship with Pakistan. It's obviously not a democracy with a military man as their leader, but they are stable. He's dealing with some of the issues, and hopefully someday it'll be democratic again. And they've got nuclear weapons, and the last thing you want is for those to fall in the hands of extremists. So I think a lot of these have been worked pretty darn hard. But you do get, like anything, when you've got something like Iraq going on, you can spend a lot of time on it. So that's a great question, Junior. Not yet to be governor of the great state of Kansas yet, and so forth. One more thing, I was just thinking about it. You talked polls, and the gentleman in the back that brought up the military and all the incidents we've had, and we have had incidents for sure, and some with terrible consequences. There is a Gallup poll done once a year on most admired institutions in the United States, and at least for the last decade, the institution most admired by the American public has been the U.S. military, by a wide margin on whoever's in second. And you've probably seen these polls. You can go Google it, call up Gallup, see the latest poll. My guess is the longer war with more incidents, the numbers will fall. I would be very surprised, just personally, if the poll would ever show the American military not the most respected institution. And I think that's what I was trying to reflect. And I think, actually, you need to reflect on that a little bit, too. Thank you, Kansas University. It's good to be here. And to end on a very light note, I was gonna make a bet on next basketball season, but we had a little event here happen not too long ago, and I think we'll wait for a while. But this is, I owe you $1. I know, Scotty, I know. We bet on every KU K-State event, and I owe Scotty some money, and it's coming. This is a very special place. This institute is very special, and I feel very honored to be here tonight, and I thank you very much for your attention. Thanks, folks. Thanks.